Hi, I'm a Boxcar Junkie and you're watching YouTube. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about physics. I absolutely love physics and I'm really excited to share some information with you today. So today we're talking about dimensions, and I know a lot of you are very confused about dimensions. It's a very confusing topic and there's a lot to be discussed about it. But it really is pretty easy to all boil down once you start from the first dimension and work your way up. And today we're going to go from the first dimension all the way up through the fifth dimension and talk about what each different dimension is and a bit about how it is shown in the world that we see around us, and how we interact with each dimension and how we don't interact with some of the dimensions, because we aren't able to interact with all of the dimensions. So to start out, let's start out with the first dimension. And imagine, if you will, a single line. Now, in our world, when we draw a line on a piece of paper, a line has length. That's all there is to it. Now, of course, there is the width of the pen that we use to draw it. But in a perfect world, when we talk about a single dimension, all we're talking about is length. And a line goes on forever and ever. It's a single line with no endpoints, and it's just that one single dimension. That is the first dimension. Now, if we enter the second dimension, we add width. So length and width. And this is where we see a plane. Now, a lot of times we'll talk about planes of existence, or planes of just spread out, all-encompassing. It goes on forever and ever in two different directions, right? This is the second dimension, and if we lived in a second dimensional world, that's what we would be in. And there would be no height to it, there would just be length and width. And we would be single points on it. So imagine, if you would, a map. A map would be something that exists in two dimensions. Everything on top of the map doesn't have height, but we just sit on top of it. And if we were to run around on this map, it would just be us as a single point on the map, moving around the map. Now, in the second dimension, imagine, if you would, a three-dimensional object moving through that second dimension. And how would that make you, as a second dimensional being, feel to experience that? Say a sphere entered the second dimension, were to pass through a second dimensional plane, and you were a point on the second dimensional plane witnessing this. The sphere passing through the second dimensional plane would at first become a point, and then it would expand and become a circle until it reached its maximum diameter of the sphere, and then it would start to shrink again and become a point, and then it would just disappear. And that would be the sphere passing through the second dimension. And as a second dimensional being experiencing this, you would be flabbergasted. You wouldn't understand what was happening. And hold that thought in your head for a second, and let's move on. So we are three-dimensional beings. We exist in a three-dimensional world. Everything around us has not only length, it also has width, and it also has height. For example, you see a box. Your box over there has length, it has width, it has height. Everything around us can be described with those three dimensions. Now, these three dimensions we are able to interact with as well. We can move forward, we can move to the side, we can move up and down. That is how our world is. It's just this three-dimensional world that we live in. It's not a plane, it's not a straight line, it is a three-dimensional world. And that is the third dimension. The third dimension is height. The first dimension is length, the second dimension is width, the third dimension is height. Now, what about the fourth dimension? This is where things start to get interesting, because we are experiencing the fourth dimension, but we are not able to manipulate it, because the fourth dimension is time. Now, when we experience time, time is very interesting for us, because we experience time only in a linear path. We can only move forward through time. We can't move backwards through it, and really there's not much of a side to side for time. So when we get into the fourth dimension, it's very much something that we observe, but we aren't able to interact with. So imagine that concept that we spoke about earlier with a three-dimensional object passing through a three-dimensional object passing through a two-dimensional plane, right? So imagine, if you would, a four-dimensional object passing through a three-dimensional world. What would that be like for us? And these are the questions that are very interesting to me, because we don't know if we've experienced these things before. How many different phenomena that are unexplainable could be explained by this experience of a four-dimensional object passing through a three-dimensional world that we just don't understand? For example, let's think about Mandela's effect, where things happen in the past one way, and in our memories they exist in one way, but in reality they are completely different. So we look at misspellings of different words, where in our minds, say, the Bernstein Bears was spelled one way, but now in reality it's spelled a totally different way. And that's just one example. There's examples. The classic example of Mandela's effect is, in fact, Nelson Mandela himself, and how in many people's memories he had died in prison, and then in 2012 he died again and made headlines, and everyone was so confused because they had thought he had already died, and there was such a huge memory of him not being alive already. So these things happen and they're unexplainable, but could they be explained by this effect? That's something that is definitely a possibility and could be considered. Although, again, it's just a theory. It's not even a theory, it's a hypothesis, because there's no way for us to experiment on that. So let's, again, diverge, move from this track of thought back to talking about the dimensions. And we've talked about all of the dimensions. Let's just do a quick recap. We've got the first dimension, which is length. We've got the second dimension, width. We've got the third dimension, height. We have the fourth dimension, time. Now that brings us to the fifth dimension. So our fifth dimension is gravity. And gravity as a dimension is kind of hard for us to grasp, because it's another thing that we experience but we cannot manipulate, and our understanding of gravity is really quite vague. You know, we understand how gravity works, and there's a lot of other theories that I could talk about in other videos, but I just can't get into right now because of what this video is all about. But as gravity, as a fifth dimension, when we talk about gravity, we're talking about falling really between realities. And so if we were to be able to move through the fourth dimension, for example, we would be able to basically time travel between our timelines, different points on our single timeline. So we would be able to go not only forward through time, but also backward through time. Now, thinking about moving through gravity, we're thinking about moving upward and downward between timelines. So imagine, if you will, all of our timelines spread out and stacked on top of each other like layered sheets on a bed. And moving in the fifth dimension would be poking holes through these sheets on the bed and falling between each different sheet. And each sheet is a different timeline, remember that. So if we were to be able to move through the fifth dimension, we would be traveling to different timelines, to alternate realities, if you would. And these would all be similar to the worlds that we live in, but also different. So each timeline, you might be a different person, you might have a different family, you might have different friends, you might have a different career, you might have gone down a different path in some point of your life, you made a different decision. And all of these different timelines are similar but different. And moving through the fifth dimension would be not only moving forward and backward through time, but up and down through these different timelines. Now, if you're interested in this and you are thinking about this, I would love for you to read some of the works that I've done. I've done some works of fiction about fifth dimensional beings and traveling through the fifth dimension, and done a little bit of writing on this. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to be publishing a short collection of works on Amazon soon, so links to that will eventually be in the description, and I'm sure I'll make videos about that in the future. But that is something that you can look forward to, and I hope you've enjoyed this video talking about the different dimensions, and I hope that I haven't confused you to no end, but this is just an interesting subject that I'd like to just talk about a little bit with you, and I hope you've enjoyed. So with that, I hope you guys all have a good day and enjoy thinking a little bit outside the box.